Hi, welcome back to Space Thoughts. It's been a few weeks since I really sat down and did a video here, and honestly, a lot of that was because I'm trying to digest what's going on in, in space policy, space law, et cetera. And there really is a lot going on, some pretty important ones in regards to national security. Hence, this one, yes, we're going to be jumping back into national security with this video. Just because really it's an important topic, and like I said, there's a lot going on right now. There's two things I wanted to talk about, and both of them are fairly controversial in terms of how the U.S. is approaching space policy in this regard. And one of them is this idea of norms, and I'm going to put norms in quotations for responsible behavior that the U.S. is going to go out and try and promote. And this ASAT, this quote ASAT testing, unilateral ASAT testing ban that the U.S. basically, in lack of a better term, obligated itself to unilateral without, just forthrightly back a couple of weeks ago. And and there's some concerns about that, and that's what we'll talk about that a little bit later. First of all, let's talk about norms. Now, this effort's been going on for ever since the beginning of this administration, and this is going to be our approach. Instead of doing the idea of we're going to learn through customary international law, which was the approach of 45's space policy, we now are going to be more direct and actually diplomatically go out and create norms, or quote norms, and I'm going to put them in quotes. And I put it in quotes because these norms that the U.S. wants to go out and promote really aren't what we call norms. And eventually, when these just going to stand do a video on norms to discuss norms, just because they're complex. But when we talk about norms, I think right toward the idea is we're really talking about customary international law, plain and simple. But the idea that the U.S. is approaching these norms, in quotations, really aren't norms. And let me explain. Back a few weeks ago, actually the beginning of April, U.S. Spacecom legal conference was held, the second annual, and one of the keynote speakers was from the Office of Secretary of Defense, and she talked about these idea of norms, and basically her iteration, what she basically said was these norms really aren't norms because in the typical sense, but they're going to be these kind of, whether they be more or less tenets or principles, but we're still going to call them norms. So I asked the question, why don't we, if we're not going to really be norms, why don't we call them something different? And there was a long explanation for that. But long story short is the understanding is, well, we'll go into the international community, we'll say these are norms when they're really not norms, and everybody will understand that, and there'll be a winks and nods that, yeah, we're talking about norms, but they're really not norms. Well, as a lawyer, that makes me uncomfortable because, especially when it comes to things like contracts, or, if I'm going to say something, I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. So if I'm going to be talking about norms, I really want to be, we should be talking about norms, but if we're not going to be talking about norms, we should be. Now, the presupposition is when we talk about norms is everybody will understand these really aren't norms, but this is the international community and this is geopolitics, and you can bet sure as anything when and if this idea of norms gets really promoted in the international community, somebody's going to say, like the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China or others that have different geopolitical interests, they're going to say, hey, these norms that you're promoting, it's customary international law. And that's going to start getting us, and that's going to get things into the mud really quick. And in my opinion, it's really going to be a tripping over a rock and falling face first in the geopolitical mud. And it's not something that I don't think will be detrimental because the U.S. will be able to fight it back, should be able to fight that off, that idea that these norms are really norms. But it's going to, it's going to get us stuck, and we're going to have to do a lot of backtracking and spend a lot of time, just extricating from ourselves. So I think this whole idea of going into this idea of creating norms that really aren't norms is a bad idea, and really taking for granted that the international community will understand that these really aren't norms. Now, this sounds convoluted, and trust me, it is. But I think the administration is putting themselves in a really bad position by going into this idea of calling these norms when they're not norms. I think an alternative is to call them tenets or principles. And this is something you see with the DoD memorandum that came out last year, is they listed these tenets and principles. They weren't norms in the sense that they didn't call them norms, but they call them tenets, but they were essentially principles. So if we go into it that way, I think it would be a lot safer. We'd have a less opportunity of tripping over a rock and falling face first into the geopolitical mud. But it appears that's the tack we're going to take, and I'm afraid it's just going to be a big mess. The second thing I wanted to talk about was this unilateral test ban. Now, back in February, I think, when this idea was being floated by NGOs, I did a video on it, and I'll link that at the end of this video if you want to go back and watch that. Again, I really thought it was a bad idea back then, and I really think it's a bad idea right now because, one, and for multiplicity of reasons. The whole idea is, we're basically banning, we're basically tying our own hands, saying we won't test direct to ASAT anti-satellite weapons, and basically we haven't really tested a weapon like that since the 80s with the Reagan administration, with the air-launched ASAT that destroyed the Sol-Wind satellite. Now, people are going to say, well, what about USA 193? Wasn't an ASAT test. Don't even go down that road. And I'm not going to even entertain the discussion because totally different circumstance than what I'm talking about here. But even though we don't test, we don't like testing weapons like that anymore, by saying we would ban ourselves, we're essentially, in a sense, tying our hands and going to our adversary saying, oh, weakness. This is an opportunity for us to jump in and score some points. And actually, the Russian Federation and the Chinese did. It's interesting. The response to this, quote, unilateral ban was playing good cop, bad cop with the Chinese basically coming in and saying, oh, no, this is a bad idea, and mentioning the PPWT. And then the Russians chimed in afterwards and said, oh, well, this is a good start. But we've had this thing called the PPWT since 2008. Actually, since 2008, we've had the PPWT. Let's get it back. Now, why is that bad? Well, back in 2018, our diplomats went to Geneva to the Conference of Disarmament, and they absolutely slaughtered the whole idea of the PPWT and the whole narrative that the Russian Federation and the PRC put out there about, this being about, banning space weapons. In other words, making an arms control argument instead of a behavior argument. And we really clobbered their argument good. And for quite a while after that, several months after, they tried to revive it, but to no avail. So I thought, it was really, really dead. However, by bringing this unilateral ban in, we've essentially given them a helping hand up. We've pulled them out of the ditch that we basically threw this argument into, hold it out, and we've given them opportunity to revive it and bring it back in. Which and so really, it's, in a sense, if you talk about lawfare, I talk about lawfare a lot. If this was intended as a lawfare move to move things in a certain direction, it actually backfired on us in that sense, because it is giving an opportunity for the Russian Federation and the PRC to get this thing back into the idea of the PPWT and arms control. Now, another reason that they wanted, and again, I think this, in my opinion, this is wholly NGO generated and such. But there was a meeting, I believe, on May 16th for the open-ended working group on sustainable use of outer space. That group met initially. There was a preparatory meeting in February, and the Russians came in and just destroyed it. They made this is a UK led effort. The Russians have pretty much said in no uncertain terms, we don't like it. We're not going to do it. And Lavrov came in and basically destroyed the preparatory meeting. Now, in my opinion, this is supposed to come, I believe, on the 16th. I think the Russians are going to come in again and just absolutely destroy everything. And I think they're going to bring the PPWT back into the equation. In other words, instead of talking about behavior, let's talk about arms control. So really, this whole idea of sustainability that is being preached is not so much about behavior. It really is about arms control. And I think this unilateral ban is really more of an arms control document versus a how you would say a behavioral document. And again, I think it's silly. I think I understand the UK is tacitly, given it its approval. South Korea has said, agreed with it. But these two states, they don't have an anti-satellite capability or a capability ancillary to missile defense that would provide them with an ASAT capability. So what? I don't think they ever had plans, and I don't think they have plans to deploy any sort of ASAT or test any sort of ASAT system. So what's the difference? What difference does it make? But I haven't heard of many other states jumping onto this. I think what the U.S. one of the things the U.S. wants to do is be able to bring this to that meeting on that's coming up and saying, well, look what we got. But again, I think it's going to be a lawfare blowback for us. It's just going to make us look weak, and give the Russian Federation and the PRC the opportunity to revive the space weapons debate and revive PPWT. Now, I don't think the PPWT is something that's going to be acceptable and signed, but it is a political tool that they use to beat the U.S. and its allies over the head, or in the past they have. And I think we've basically, by taking this initiative, we've basically done the same thing. So I really liken it to this administration's code of conduct. Now, back during 44's administration, there was a European code of conduct that absolutely fell flat on its face and revived by the U.S. and the International Code of Conduct. And I wrote extensively about this back then, and I wasn't wrong. And there was a lot of problems with it, and I wrote about those, and I wasn't wrong about those, and I got very involved with it. So, and that ended up falling flat on its face too, the International Code of Conduct, just because it had way too many problems. Again, I think it was supposed to mitigate. It was supposed to actually talk about behavior, but I think it was more about arms. There's really an arms control tenor underneath it, in that sense. And of course, the Russian Federation and the PRC didn't like it because they had the PPWT, which they actually presented a modified draft. So it was really a mess. And I think this idea of a unilateral ban with this open-ended working group is going to be another code of conduct. And honestly, I think it's going to be a train wreck. I mean, everything I've seen tells me the Russians and the Chinese just have their own agenda, and they're going to do everything they can to basically upend it and destroy it. So it's going to be a train wreck, in my opinion. We'll see. I could be wrong, but then again, I could be right about it too. We'll see. But again, I think this unilateral ban was a misstep, a political misstep, or a geopolitical misstep from that. I know this, and I'm not bashing it. I'm not. People say, well, you're being political. No, I'm not being political. I'm being realistic, and I'm looking at this from a lawyer's perspective and somebody who studies strategy, who thinks strategically in terms of lawfare and stuff like that. So again, I think between the idea of norms and this unilateral ban, we've definitely put ourselves into a bad position geopolitically and strategically. This whole idea of strategic cooperation or strategic balancing really isn't working out, and I think it's really turning more into an idea of strategic retreat in the outer space domain, as opposed to maintaining some sort of asymmetric advantage, or maintaining space control for that matter. And I did a video a while back on space controls. You can go back and watch that and some of my feelings on that as well. So again, I think these two efforts are putting us into a very dangerous position. The Russian Federation, the PRC, their alliance has grown steadily and aggressively, even and increasingly so even after the invasion of Ukraine. I think their outer space has become even more dangerous right now, and I think we're going to be in for some interesting times. What do I mean by interesting times? Well, I'll leave that to your imagination, and maybe I'll elaborate at a later time. But again, I think these two approaches to space policy, which I think are more of a product of comparative geopolitics. In other words, geopolitics based on ideology, that we think this is how they should behave based on our ideology, as opposed to classical geopolitics as looking at past actions, looking at current actions to determine what future adversaries or rivals' future actions will be. I think these two approaches are all comparative geopolitics, and I think they're going to leave us in a bad position strategically in outer space, to be honest with you. Again, I'm not here to I'm not here to be political, but I'm here to call it like I see it, and that's how I see it. So anyways, it's spring here in the northern hemisphere, definitely fall in the southern hemisphere. I hope you're safe, and I hope you're healthy, and I will talk to you next time.